My name is Beth Mizell, and I'm actually an employee of the Blue Ridge Prism. I'm the program director for that organization. I've been in the role for just about a year. Tim is a Charlottesville area tree steward, and he is also serves on our leadership team and is one of our critical volunteers to make the work of Prism possible. And with that, I will go ahead and get started with the presentation. I'm going to do the first half of the presentation, and then I will turn it over to Tim, and he will talk to you about things that you can do to help control English ivy and other invasive vines in particular on trees.
Thank you.
So first of all, there we go. Okay. So I just wanted to take a moment to remind you, or if you're not up to speed on this particular topic, what an invasive species actually is. So an invasive species is a species that is non-native to the ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So invasive species, in this case, invasive plants and invasive vines, they're unimpeded by things that keep them in check in their native region, like animals, insects, and fungi. These plants have no natural enemies here, and as a result, they dominate and outcompete native trees, shrubs, grasses, and other native plants by smothering them, by directly competing for nutrients, water, and sunlight, by altering the soil chemistry, and or by stressing the trees by their sheer weight. Invasive species spread aggressively and displace or destroy both native and commercially cultivated plants and animals. After habitat alteration, invasive species are the greatest threat to natural systems, agriculture, and aquaculture. So basically, invasive plants take up space, they harm native plants, and they provide little or no food value to animals, birds, insects, and they disrupt the locally evolved food web and ecosystem. Most things cannot and will not eat them. For example, native caterpillars cannot feed on them because they did not evolve with the plants, so they can't digest the leaf tissues. And then, so there's no native caterpillars, so then birds are not able, there's no caterpillars for birds to eat while they're raising their young. Deer also generally avoid them because they are unpalatable or difficult to eat. And not only are invasive plants environmentally harmful, they're expensive. Invasive species, rather, they're expensive. In 2005, it was estimated that invasive species cost the United States more than $120 billion a year. I'm sure that number is significantly more at this point. Annually, invasive species, plants, animals, insects, cost Virginia more than $1 billion. So your neighborhood's trees are both valuable to you and wildlife. The urban canopy gives your neighborhood character, provides erosion control, shade, and so many other ecological benefits to birds, wildlife, and insects. And you want to ensure that those trees stay healthy for the long term and safe, and also that you have the next generation of trees for the future. So invasive vines pose a threat to trees. So how do invasive vines harm trees in your neighborhood? So first, invasive vines can choke trees. They wind around the tree, girdling it, cutting off its nutrients. And some examples of vines that do that are Japanese honeysuckle and invasive bittersweet. Invasive vines also can break a tree. So the tree cannot support the excessive weight of the vine and breaks. Some of these invasive vines can get like 4 to 6 inches in diameter. And that is a lot of weight that the tree has to support. In particular, evergreen invasive vines like winter creeper and English ivy are particularly problematic during the winter. Ice and snow events may accumulate on the evergreen leaves, weighing the trees even more. Broken limbs and tops are not only dangerous, but it makes a tree vulnerable to disease and decay, shortening its life. A tree can just succumb to the excessive weight of an invasive vine. Invasive vines can also smother a tree. And so you have vines like kudzu and porcelainberry that overtop the trees and block the sunlight from reaching the tree leaves. The tree dies when it cannot get enough sunlight to produce food. The weight of the vines on the top of the tree and can actually break it as well. So I just want to take a few minutes to go through a few invasive vines that are in your neighborhood. I live in the Fifeville neighborhood, and we have the exact same vines. So I know that you will see them just driving down your road, and but you may not realize what they are. So the first invasive vine that we have is invasive bittersweet, and some people call it oriental bittersweet. I'm trying to move away from that name and just refer to it as invasive bittersweet. So this is a vine that actually chokes, and it also smothers and breaks our native trees in urban canopy. It's a deciduous twining vine with rounded, finely toothed leaves. The stems can be up to 4 inches in diameter. And you can see in the photo here that those stems are very large. It was introduced in the 1860s as a garden plant. It's tolerant of shade and can be problematic in forests, smothering and its weight taking down mature trees. The dense thickets shade and smother shrubs and native ground cover. And bittersweet spreads primarily by seed and is moved around by birds who eat the seeds. So some ways to identify it is it has a reddish root, as shown in the upper right photo. And the bark is often light gray and silvery or light brown with obvious spots or lenticels. It often wraps around the trunk, girdling the tree. And the berries are green now, but will turn orange and split to reveal red berries in the fall. And we'll see a picture of that later in the presentation. The next vine that I wanted to highlight is Japanese honeysuckle. And this is also a vine that chokes trees. This is one that I'm sure many of you know by its showy and fragrant flowers. I have really fond memories of my childhood in Indiana, getting the flowers and getting that little bit of nectar out of it and tasting it is really sweet, and that really fragrant smell during the summer. But Japanese honeysuckle is not a good vine for our trees. They form thick tangles of vines that smother and kill vegetation. It kills shrubs and trees by girdling them. And I just want to point out that the photo in the upper left inset is an example of how Japanese honeysuckle twines around a tree, sapling, and girdles it, effectively killing the tree. The next vine I'd like to highlight is the one that probably most of you are familiar with, and this is English ivy. And this is a vine that likes to break trees. So English ivy is often planted as a ground cover, and that's why we see it all over Charlottesville and other urban areas, because it was intentionally planted and then it quickly escaped cultivation. So English ivy quickly climbs a tree, and the weight of the vine can pull a tree down and make it vulnerable to damage during snow and ice events from the excess weight. And you can see an example of these trees that have been covered with ivy in the lower right photo. That's actually at Forest Hills Park along the walking trail. And all of those trees are completely infested with English ivy, amongst other invasive things. So English ivy becomes reproductive when it goes vertical, and it produces berries that are often consumed by birds. And in the upper right photo, the seedlings I'm holding were germinated after being deposited by birds hanging out in the trees in my yard. So maybe the birds in Fire Springs ate those berries and brought them over here to Fifeville, and I have to keep pulling seedlings out of my gardens. Winter creeper is another invasive vine that likes to break trees. It's very similar to English ivy in its growth habits. It's evergreen, it climbs trees, and it smothers plants. Birds also disperse the seeds widely. And this is one that you may be most familiar with, in addition to English ivy, is kudzu. We have quite a bit of it in Charlottesville, unfortunately. Kudzu is often referred to as the vine that ate the South. It's an aggressive vine that forms a dense cover, smothering and depriving trees, shrubs, and ground cover of sunlight. So this is a smothering kind of vine. The vines are climbing, coiling, and trailing. The young stems are covered in fine hairs. It has compound leaves with 3 leaflets, and each leaflet is about 6 inches long, and it's medium to light green. And the leaflets are lobed and hairy underneath, and you can kind of see some of the lobing in the photo to the left. The photo to the left and the photo in the lower right were actually taken along Elliott Street. I get those streets confused. It's near my house off Cherry Avenue. So here in Charlottesville. And then the last vine I wanted to highlight is one that is very common in Charlottesville, and it is particularly common in Fifeville. And I mentioned earlier that I live on 7.5 Street, and I live near kind of between Tonsler Park and Forest Hills Park. And the picture to the left is actually across the street from me. The woods is completely infested with porcelainberry, and it's really sad because it makes like playing outdoors for children virtually impossible. So a little bit about porcelainberry, that it can be easily confused with a native grapevine. The leaf ID is really tricky because it looks like the native grape. The vines, I don't have a photo here of the vines, but the bark is really firm and doesn't peel. And a native grapevine is real shreddy bark, and it readily peels off in strips. You can cut the stem to check the pith or the center of the plant stem. Porcelainberry is white and grape is brown. And right now, the berries are actually the easiest way to identify this plant. They have irregular small clumps of multicolored fruit, and the color ranges from lavender to dark purple to blue. And in the lower right photo, you can see on the fruit, they have these little tiny dots, and it almost looks like, I think it kind of looks like candy, but it's not good to eat at all. And the berries grow downward. So porcelainberry, and it's not really common out in the county or surrounding areas, but it will be because the birds do eat it and move it around readily. But again, pretty bad in Charlottesville. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tim, and he is going to talk to you about how to control some of these invasive vines. Tim?
Yeah, go ahead. You can go to the next one. Yeah, so here's some of the common tools. Typically, you're going to use pruning tools, a hand cutter or a hand pruner, like the one in the middle here, a pruning saw of some type. And there are some circumstances where you may want to use a hatchet, and I'll explain those as we go along. Next. If you're an herbicide user, there are various applicators that you can use. When you make a cut in a vine, if you don't apply an herbicide, everything above where you make the cut is dead, but everything below where you make the cut is still alive. So the root system is still alive, the stem's still alive, and it's going to sprout new growth. And you saved a couple of years, but it's going to grow back. If you apply an herbicide to where you make the cut, it will not grow back. So here's 3 herbicide applicators. On the left is a dauber, just as kind of a cloth tip, and you just touch it to the cut end where you cut the vine, and it leaves a very small amount of herbicide, which is all you need. Or you can use a spray bottle or a drip bottle to drip on some herbicide. Next. So you'll see the first thing you want to do with ivy is, if you find it on trees, it's going to be all over the ground because it starts out as a creeping vine. The only way it can reproduce is by creeping. So it creeps along the ground, comes to anything vertical, and it treats anything vertical as a trellis. and it wants to climb. It wants to get up in the sun so that it can convert from its immature stage where it can only spread by creeping to its mature stage where it can produce berries and then it can propagate by seed, and then you see it all over the place. So you want to get those vines first before you get the stuff on the ground. When you cut a vine, you don't want to try to pull it off the tree. First, it's likely to strip the bark. If you do get it off, it's likely to break and come down on you. And this stuff isn't light and can injure you. It can also be attached to live or dead branches, and if you pull on it, you're liable to pull the branches down on yourself. So it's just not a safe practice. Leave the vines in place. Over time, they're going to dry out. They're going to turn gray. They're going to look the same color as the bark. And eventually, although it takes a few years, they're simply going to fall off the tree. So they take care of themselves. You don't have to pull them off. Okay, once you have the vines off, then you do have to get the stuff that's on the ground, or you're just going to get new vines climbing up the tree. And there are various ways you can do that. Again, you can use an herbicide approach if you have just tons and tons of it and there's too much to hand pull, or it's in a position in the forest where you can't get a mower in there to do any mowing. So sometimes herbicide spray is the only technique that you can use to control it. But then there's goats. So you can go out and hire a group, a herd of goats, and there are goat herders who know how to do this. And they will put up a little fence and keep the goats fenced in on your property until they've eaten all the ivy off the ground and as far up as they can reach onto the trunks of trees. And that's fine, and it's pretty impressive to watch and fun to watch, but it doesn't affect the roots. So after they're gone, a lot of it's simply going to grow back. But it's fun to watch. Next one. So there's 3 different growth habits for vines that you'll see. Bess talked a little bit about the one on the left, the girdling vines. They stay attached to the tree trunk by wrapping around it. And as the tree tries to grow in girth, it grows against the vine. And what you see happening is what you see here in this photograph, and that is it constricts around the trunk and doesn't allow water and nutrients to move up and down through the trunk of the tree because it's constricting the vascular tissue, and that can kill the tree. In the middle, you see the form of vines that's called attached, like English ivy and winter creeper. And they form little adventitious roots which actually grow right into the bark of the tree. You can't pull them off without stripping the bark. Third kind of vines you're going to find are unattached vines that just kind of hang off the tree. And they're pretty easy ones to deal with a tool like a set of loppers. You can also use a saw on them. Next. So let's say you have these unattached vines. Bittersweet is an example of those. What you want to do is you want to track them down where they come off the tree and see where they go into the ground. Track it down to where it comes out of the ground. Next slide. Excuse me. And you want to cut the vine right at ground level. Now, if you're not an herbicide user, if you cut something like honeysuckle or bittersweet, even English ivy, the large vines, they are going to grow back. Some of them are going to grow back in multiples. If you don't use herbicide, it just means you're going to have to come back again and cut and cut and cut, probably 3 or 4 iterations until you've exhausted all the stored food in the roots. But eventually you can win at that game. It just takes you a lot more work. If you're an herbicide user, you make the cut once, and you can see here in the photo on the lower right, you make the cut flat like a tabletop, parallel with the sky, and you drip on or daub on or spray on just a little tiny bit of herbicide. You cut it flat so it won't drip off, and it kills the roots, and it will not grow back. Okay, next. And you're not done once you've made that cut on your vine. You want to make a second cut up higher where it's very easy to see. You can see in the photo on the right that a bunch of vines have been cut. That's all bittersweet. And they were cut high so that it's obvious to anyone who comes up later that they don't have to do any more cutting on this. It's done for. The other reason you make a cut is because if you look closely at this photo on the left, you'll see that there are actually 3 different vines there wrapped around each other. So even if you've killed the vine at ground level, new vines can grow up and use that existing vine to climb up into the tree. basically to use it as a trellis. You don't want to leave that capability, so cut it high. And just let it lie on the ground, and that way you won't have the ability for new vines to climb up the tree using the old ones. Okay. All right, so here's a different approach, and one that you can use when you have large vines. On the left, we're looking at bittersweet, and those are 6 or 8 inch vines. They're really big. The normal technique that you use for those is you take a saw, and you have to make 2 cuts. You're going to cut all the way through all the vines around the tree. But if you just make 1 cut, sometimes they can reseal. So you have to make a second cut, 2 or 3 inches higher, or 6 inches higher, or lower, so that you're leaving a gap. On these really big vines, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of sawing. You could actually do that with a chainsaw. But another approach is to simply take a hatchet and take 1 big hack into the vine. As you see in the center photo there, it was hit once with a hatchet. And then on the right, you can see that an herbicide, a small amount of herbicide, was introduced into that cut. And that herbicide is going to travel down through the vascular system into the roots and kill the vine, and it will not grow back. So it's a lot easier than taking a couple big hunks out of that big vine. So we're trying to help you to be efficient when you're dealing with large quantities of big vines. Next. Yes, English ivy. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so the very first step with English ivy, and I'm thinking of the ones, the trees that are in your parking lot there at the church. They're totally covered with ivy, and you can't see the vine structure underneath, and it's the vines that you have to cut. So your very first stage is you've got to strip those leaves off so that you can expose the vines so you can see them and you know what you have to cut. So you can see there I'm holding a saw, and I'm holding it almost vertically and scraping it, running it down the side of the tree to strip off all the leaves, thereby exposing the vines. Once you've got all the leaves off, you can see what you have, and you can start to cut the vines. So next step, here we go. On the left, you can see a pretty heavily covered tree before I stripped off the leaves, and over on the right after I stripped them off. It made it possible for me to see what it is I have to work on. Next one. So the next thing you want to do is you need to make the cuts, as I mentioned, 2 cuts, 1 lower and 1 higher, all the way around the tree. You have to cut every one of the vines twice, and it's pretty well exemplified here. This tree on the right, we had to do with a chainsaw. Those are all about 4 inches around. The thing is, you got to be careful when you're making these cuts. If you look at the red arrow on the photo on the left, you can see that somebody got a little bit over enthusiastic with their saw. They cut right through the vines and into the trunk of the tree. You don't want to do that. So be careful when you're cutting the vines not to cut into the tree. Okay, next one. All right, so let's just say that you've made these cuts around the tree. If you're an herbicide user, you can see in the photo on the right that we have a dye in the herbicide here, so it's easy to see. You would then daub on or drip on or spray on a very small amount of herbicide to those lower cuts, the ones that are connected to the stem that goes down into the roots. And the herbicide will move downward through the stems into the roots and kill the roots, and it will not grow back. As I mentioned before, if you look at the photo on the left, if you're not an herbicide user, you still make the same cuts all the way around, 2 cuts, leaving a gap. Everything above the cuts is dead. What's below the cuts is not dead, and it's going to grow back. It just means you're going to have to go back and recut that one again repeatedly until you've exhausted all the stored food in the roots, which could take 3 or 4 iterations over the course of 2 or 3 seasons. So the Blue Ridge Prism is not in the business of trying to encourage anyone to use herbicides that does not want to use them. We simply want to point out that you end up with 4 or 5 times as much work if you don't use them. Next slide. Okay, this I gave an example of before. If you have what you'll have when you strip off the leaves on a heavily infested tree with English ivy on it is you'll have some very, very small vines, some kind of medium-sized ones, and often some very big ones. And just to save your time with those big ones, you can use that hack and squirt approach that I mentioned before. Take your hatchet, And on the left photo, you can see the yellow circle. I mean, one cut with the hatchet into that vine. And on the right, you can see where I introduced a little bit of herbicide. And that's it for that vine. I didn't have to cut it low and then cut it high. So it saves you a lot of cutting. Okay, what do we have next? Ah, you can take up again, Beth.
Okay, I'll take over. It takes a while for the ivy or the ivy in particular to die. There is a lot of energy in those vines as they reach up in the trees. They're very large. So it can take several weeks to see noticeable results, especially with English ivy. But so be patient and your trees will thank you. You may even hear them saying, "Thank you so much. You saved me." And it's well worth the effort to save the beautiful tree in your front yard or backyard that brings you so much enjoyment and benefits.
I do want to mention, Beth, in this photo,
Uh-huh.
this English ivy was cut 3 months before. So it took about 2.5 months before you even see the leaves start to wilt. But believe me, it's going to happen. It just takes a long time because there's so much food and water and nutrients stored in the thick, waxy leaves themselves and the vines. It takes a long time to show that you've actually done the job.
Yes. And then also keep in mind that if there's a lot of the invasive vines that are on the ground, in particular ivy, taking it off the tree is a temporary solution, as Tim mentioned. You're going to remove you're going to kill the vine from wherever you cut it up to the tree. And then you need to think about controlling the vines that are on the ground, and you can use a foliar spray herbicide. You can also hand pull them and cut them with a string trimmer. So there's several different techniques to help you to control the vines on the ground. You can go to Blue Ridge Prism's website, and we have a lot of wonderful fact sheets that give you more information on different strategies to control the vines on the ground. But you have to control the vines on the ground to keep them from growing back up into the tree. So anytime you're managing invasive plants on your land, it is a longer term proposition, and you have to monitor it and control as needed, depending on the technique you choose. And then lastly, I just wanted to offer, so please get in touch with Tim or me if you have any questions. Our contact information is on the slide.